On Saturday, May 10th, Iran expanded the war, not deeper into the Strait of Hormuz, not against American warships, against Qatar, against the United Arab Emirates, against Kuwait. 3 Gulf states that are not America, not Israel, not the United Kingdom. 3 states that have been trying to stay out of direct military confrontation with Iran while the US-Iran war ran its course. Iran struck all 3 on the same day. The details are extraordinary. Iran deployed drones against Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait simultaneously. And then Iran sent 2 Sukhoi Su-24 bomber aircraft toward Doha, toward Qatar's capital, toward an airport that is not a military target, toward the city that hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the largest U.S. Air Force installation in the Middle East, but also a civilian international hub used by millions of travelers. Qatar's air defenses engaged the Su-24s. Qatar's forces shot both planes down. And then, according to Channel 12 and Western diplomatic sources cited by the Jerusalem Post, Qatar struck Iran in retaliation. Qatar, not America, not Israel. Qatar struck Iran. And Trump told about the full scope of what happened. Iran's response to the one-page MOU proposal, the multi-state Gulf attacks, the Su-24 shootdowns, Qatar's counterstrike, posted on Truth Social that Iran's response to the peace proposal was totally unacceptable. He said, if there's no ceasefire, you're not going to have to know. You're just going to have to look at one big glow coming out of Iran. Totally unacceptable. One big glow. The White House, asked whether Trump was threatening nuclear weapons, said only the president knows what he would do on Iran. Multiple right-wing commentators and many Democrats condemned the post. Some called for Trump to be removed through the 25th Amendment. The Secretary General of Amnesty International said the statement may constitute a threat to commit genocide. Genocide. Amnesty International used that word about a statement by the President of the United States in response to a war that is now 71 days old and has expanded to strikes against Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE on the same day that Iran's peace proposal was called totally unacceptable. I want to spend today explaining exactly what Saturday's events mean for this war, why Iran attacking Qatar specifically is a strategic choice with consequences that go far beyond any individual military exchange, what one big glow tells you about where Trump's decision-making has moved, and why the day after Iran fired on Gulf states might be the most important 48 hours since February 28th. Let me start with what Iran attacked and why the target list matters. Qatar is not a neutral party in this conflict, but it has been a specifically careful one. Qatar hosts Al Udeid Air Base, USAF's forward headquarters for Central Command, home to the Combined Air Operations Center that coordinates air missions across the Middle East. Qatar also hosts Hamas's political leadership and has served as a mediator between Israel and Hamas in Gaza ceasefire negotiations. Qatar has maintained relationships with Iran throughout the current conflict, including hosting back-channel communications. Qatar sent its foreign minister to talk to Araghchi. Qatar was on the list of countries Araghchi called during his 7-call day on May 2nd. Qatar is simultaneously the country most directly hosting American military power in the Gulf and the country most actively maintaining diplomatic relationships with Iran. This is Qatar's deliberate strategic position. It has been Qatar's national policy for 30 years. Be indispensable to all parties, host the Americans, talk to everyone, mediate between enemies, never become a target. Qatar mediated between the US and Taliban in 2013 and 2020. Qatar hosted the Gaza ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas. Qatar maintained the channel to Iran throughout the current war. Qatar was Araghchi's May 2nd phone call, one of the 7 calls in one day that I described as Iran building a coalition of witnesses before its next move. And Qatar hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the largest US Air Force installation in the Middle East, home to the Combined Air Operations Center, the CAOC, that coordinates all American air missions across the Central Command area of responsibility. The CAOC at Al Udeid was the operational hub for Operation Midnight Hammer on February 28th. The targeting decisions, the mission coordination, the battle management for the strikes on Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan, all of that ran through the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid. Iran targeted Qatar anyway. Not the Al Udeid Air Base specifically. Western diplomats and Channel 12 described the target as Doha's airport and the capital. Iran sent 2 crewed Su-24 bombers toward Qatar's capital. Qatar shot them down. Qatar struck Iran in retaliation. What does Iran gain by attacking Qatar? By attacking Qatar, Iran sends a message to every Gulf state that believed neutrality was protection. It is not. The message is, if you host American forces and maintain relationships with America's enemies, you are not safe simply because you also maintain relationships with us. The attack on Qatar says the Hormuz conflict has no neutral parties among Gulf states. You are either with Iran on the terms Iran has set, or you are a target. And if your territory is hosting the operational center that coordinated the bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities, you are specifically a target. The UAE is the second target, and its significance is different. Iran has already struck the UAE twice, Monday's Fujairah strike and the second Tuesday strike. Saturday's drone strike is the third. The UAE has been the most explicit Gulf state casualty of this war. Its oil bypass infrastructure at Fujairah was hit. Its schools closed. Its missile alerts went off. The UAE refused to support Project Freedom. The UAE was attacked anyway. The pattern of UAE attacks throughout this conflict is Iran demonstrating that refusing to support American military operations does not protect you from Iranian strikes if you are a Gulf state with economic interests that touch the Hormuz dispute. Kuwait is the third target and the most surprising. Kuwait has the smallest military footprint in this conflict of any of the three. Kuwait has been genuinely cautious. It has not made statements, has not hosted operations, has not been involved in any of the diplomatic tracks. Kuwait was struck anyway. Kuwait being struck tells every Gulf observer that even explicit non-involvement is not protection. This is Iran's message to the Gulf. The Bab el-Mandeb card is not the only unrevealed card Iran holds. The Gulf states themselves are the unrevealed card. Iran has been operating with restraint toward Gulf Arab states throughout this war, attacking only the UAE's bypass infrastructure and not its central infrastructure or its capital. On Saturday, Iran expanded the targeting to Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE simultaneously. That expansion is Iran showing the Gulf states what it has been holding back and choosing not to use. Now, let me explain the Su-24 incident, because two Iranian bombers approaching Qatar's capital is different from everything else that has happened in this war. The Sukhoi Su-24 is a Soviet-era swing-wing strike aircraft. It is designed for ground attack missions, precision strikes against specific ground targets using guided munitions. It is not a reconnaissance aircraft. It is not a cruise missile platform. It is a crewed bomber that requires pilots to fly it into range of the target. Two Su-24s flying toward Doha means two Iranian pilots were in the cockpits of those aircraft flying toward Qatar's capital. Qatar shot them down, both of them. This means Qatar's air defenses engaged and destroyed crewed Iranian military aircraft. The pilots of those aircraft either ejected and survived, ejected and are missing, or did not eject and are dead. In any of those scenarios, Iranian Air Force personnel were directly involved in a strike mission against Qatar's capital and were killed or captured or are missing. This is different from every other incident in this war. America has killed Iranian sailors and IRGC personnel. Iran has wounded American sailors. American helicopters have sunk Iranian gunboats. Iranian missiles have struck UAE facilities. But two crewed Iranian bombers flying toward a Gulf state capital and being shot down by that state's air defenses is a direct state-on-state military engagement between Iran and Qatar. Qatar defending its capital against Iranian bomber aircraft is not asymmetric guerrilla warfare. It is conventional air combat. And then Qatar struck Iran. Western diplomats and Channel 12 confirmed Qatari strikes on Iranian territory. Qatar is a country of 3 million people with a military of approximately 12,000 active personnel. It is not a military superpower, but Qatar has one of the most modern and expensive air forces in the region. Qatar purchased 36 F-15QA advanced fighter jets from Boeing, the most advanced export variant of the F-15E Strike Eagle, capable of air-to-air combat and precision ground strikes. Qatar specifically acquired these aircraft after years of threat assessment that identified Iran's air power and ballistic missiles as the primary risks to Qatari national security. When Qatar says it shot down two Su-24s and struck Iran, it is Qatar deploying the exact capability it purchased specifically to defend against and respond to Iranian air threats. Qatar also has a formal defense cooperation agreement with the United States. The agreement commits America to Qatar's defense. It does not trigger an automatic military response, but it creates a framework within which a Qatari request for American support is pre-authorized in principle. If Qatar formally invokes the defense agreement in response to Iranian strikes on its territory, the United States has a treaty obligation to respond, not a moral obligation, not a political preference, a legal treaty obligation. This is the most significant escalation pathway that Saturday's events have opened. Qatar has not yet formally invoked the defense agreement, but Qatar's strikes on Iran mean Qatar has already responded militarily. The question is whether Qatar requests American support for that response, which would draw America formally into a direct defense commitment to Qatar that goes beyond the current Project Freedom operation. Kuwait has a similar defense arrangement with the United States. Kuwait strikes, if Kuwait was struck and responds, would create the same escalation pathway. America defending Kuwait has deep historical precedent. The 1991 Gulf War was primarily fought to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. American political and military culture has a strong memory of Kuwait as a country America defended with overwhelming force. If Iran strikes Kuwait and Kuwait invokes its defense arrangement, the one big glow threat becomes not just Trump's preference, but an American treaty commitment. Now, let me explain Trump's totally unacceptable and one big glow. Trump's reaction to Saturday's events was in two parts. First, he said Iran's response to the peace proposal was totally unacceptable. This is the diplomatic reaction. Iran replied to the 14-point MOU with a counter that Trump is characterizing as not meeting the threshold for deal-making. The phrase totally unacceptable is more absolute than his previous characterizations. He has said before that proposals were not enough, or that he can't imagine they would be acceptable, and totally unacceptable is a harder rejection. Second, he said, if there's no ceasefire, you're not going to have to know. You're just going to have to look at one big glow coming out of Iran. One big glow. That phrase has a specific resonance in the context of nuclear weapons. It sounds like a nuclear threat. The White House subsequently said that only the president knows what he would do on Iran. Multiple commentators and Democrats called for him to be removed through the 25th Amendment. The Secretary General of Amnesty International said the statement may constitute a threat to commit genocide. Whether Trump meant nuclear or conventional, one big glow is the language of complete destruction rather than surgical military action. It is Trump describing the most extreme possible military response to continued Iranian non-compliance. It is Trump communicating to Iran and to every Gulf state watching. The escalation ceiling I am describing is not proportionate military response. It is obliteration. Iran attacked Qatar on the same day Trump received Iran's totally unacceptable reply to the peace proposal. Those two events, the expanded Gulf strikes and the rejected proposal, happened simultaneously. Iran's decision to expand strikes to 3 Gulf states while simultaneously submitting what Trump characterizes as a totally unacceptable peace proposal is the most aggressive combination of actions Iran has taken since the ceasefire began on April 7th. Is Iran deliberately escalating to force a more favorable deal, or has Iran made a strategic decision to widen the war rather than accept American nuclear terms? Those two interpretations have very different implications. The escalation to deal interpretation says Iran is demonstrating its capacity to impose costs on American allies throughout the Gulf, showing that the war's costs are not limited to Iran and America, but extend to every Gulf state in the region. This demonstration is designed to create pressure on Gulf Arab states to push America toward a more accommodating negotiating position. Saudi Arabia has already refused to support Project Freedom. The UAE is being struck repeatedly. Kuwait and Qatar are now in the conflict. If the Gulf states tell America to accept a deal before the region's stability collapses, Iran benefits from the Gulf pressure without having to make the nuclear concessions America demands. The widened war interpretation says Iran has calculated that the deal America is offering, 12 years of no enrichment, surrender of 440 kilograms of 60% uranium, is worse than continued conflict. Iran is choosing escalation over capitulation. The Gulf strikes are Iran saying, if you want a war, we will show you what a real war in this region looks like. Not just Hormuz, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, a region in crisis, oil disrupted from every possible channel, Gulf states in direct conflict with Iran. Both interpretations may be partially correct simultaneously. Iran may be escalating to force a better deal, while also genuinely accepting the risk that escalation produces resumed American bombing rather than a revised offer. That is the bet Iran made on Saturday. Now let me steelman Iran's position, because attacking Qatar is not random. Qatar hosted the talks that were supposed to end the Gaza war. Qatar has been America's primary Middle East diplomatic intermediary for a decade. Qatar hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the forward headquarters of the military campaign that bombed Iran's nuclear facilities on February 28th. From Iran's perspective, Qatar's neutrality is illusory. Qatar hosts the Air Operations Center that coordinated Operation Midnight Hammer. Qatar has provided the infrastructure and the logistics for the American military campaign that Iran is defending against. Attacking the facility that enabled the bombing of your nuclear infrastructure is, from Iran's strategic perspective, not aggression against a neutral party. It is a strike at the operational root of what was done to Iran. The Al Udeid Air Base is not a neutral installation. It is the most operationally significant American military facility in the war against Iran. And the two Su-24s were likely targeting Al Udeid specifically, not the civilian airport. Qatar's air defenses engage anything approaching Al Udeid. The civilian Hamad International Airport is co-located in the same general area. Doha is a small city, and both facilities are within the same geographic zone. Saying Iran tried to hit Doha Airport may be a civilian framing of a military target approach. The Su-24s were almost certainly targeting the CAOC at Al Udeid. Here is where the steelman collapses. Qatar's civilian airport and Qatar's capital are adjacent to Al Udeid. Two Iranian bombers approaching Doha were approaching a civilian population center regardless of their specific military objective. 3 million people live in Qatar. A Su-24 strike that misses Al Udeid hits Doha. That is not a theoretical risk. That is the operational reality of the attack's geometry. Iran sent crude bombers toward a city of 3 million people. Qatar was right to shoot them down. And Kuwait. Kuwait has no military footprint in this war. Kuwait is not a logistics base for American operations. Kuwait is not hosting American units. Kuwait is a small Gulf monarchy that has been as genuinely uninvolved in the direct conflict as it is possible to be. Iran striking Kuwait is Iran targeting a country that is not a military actor in this war. That is either a mistake, wrong intelligence about Kuwaiti involvement, or it is deliberate expansion of targeting criteria to include all Gulf states regardless of involvement. Both of those possibilities are alarming in different ways. Watch whether the U.S. resumes Operation Midnight Hammer level strikes in response to Saturday's multi-state Gulf attacks. Trump's one big glow is the most escalatory language he has used since the war began. Watch whether Qatar and Kuwait invoke their mutual defense agreements with America. Both countries have formal defense agreements with the U.S. that could trigger a mandatory American response to state attacks on their territory. Watch whether Iran's totally unacceptable reply to the one-page MOU is formally withdrawn, or whether it remains as a counterproposal that Trump rejected. And watch whether Saudi Arabia changes its position on neutrality now that 3 of its Gulf neighbors have been struck simultaneously. Iran tried to hit Doha Airport. Qatar shot down 2 jets and struck Iran. Trump said totally unacceptable and one big glow 71 days into this war. On Saturday, it expanded to include 3 more states. The ceasefire of April 7th is in its final hours, if it has not already ended. If you found this useful, push back on it in the comments. I will see you in the next one. Let me also address the deal dimension, because Saturday's events happened simultaneously with Trump receiving Iran's reply to the one-page MOU. The sequence is critical. Iran submitted its response to the 14-point MOU to Pakistani mediators. Trump received the response. Trump called it totally unacceptable. On the same day, Iran conducted drone strikes against Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait. Iran sent 2 Su-24 bombers toward Doha. Qatar shot them down and struck Iran. Was the multi-state Gulf attack coordinated with the diplomatic rejection, or did it happen independently of the diplomatic track? The answer to that question determines whether Iran is waging war while submitting unacceptable proposals as a negotiating tactic, or whether Iran's military and diplomatic tracks are genuinely separate processes running in parallel. The coordination interpretation says Iran submitted a proposal it knew Trump would reject, and simultaneously executed the Gulf strikes as a demonstration of what continued war looks like. The message is, you rejected our proposal. Here is the cost of continued war spreading to Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE. Make a deal or this keeps expanding. The parallel interpretation says Iran's military commanders and Iran's diplomatic team are operating under different instructions with different timelines from a supreme leader communicating by motorcycle courier who may not be coordinating the two tracks in real time. The Gulf strikes happened because the IRGC commanders made an operational decision to expand the pressure campaign, and the diplomatic reply happened because the foreign ministry processed the 14-point MOU on its own timeline. The motorcycle courier chain produces exactly the kind of coordination failure that could result in simultaneous military escalation and diplomatic submission. A decision to escalate militarily and a decision to submit an unacceptable diplomatic response are both made somewhere in the Iranian command structure. If they are made by different people on different timescales, they can produce the simultaneous, apparently contradictory Saturday outcome. Pakistan said last week that its expectation was for an agreement sooner rather than later. Trump said Saturday that Iran's response was totally unacceptable. Pakistan said there will be no winners in an expanded conflict. That three-way summary, Pakistan optimistic, Trump rejecting, Iran expanding, describes a negotiation that is simultaneously more advanced and more dangerous than at any previous point. Watch whether America responds to Saturday's Gulf strikes with new bombing of Iranian territory. The one big glow threat requires a response to be credible. If Trump says totally unacceptable and one big glow and then nothing happens, Iran reads the inaction as a signal that the rhetoric is performative. If America resumes full-scale bombing in response to the Gulf strikes and the rejected proposal, the ceasefire is definitively over and the comprehensive peace process being described by the State Department collapses. Watch whether Qatar formally invokes its defense cooperation agreement with America. That invocation would create a treaty obligation, not a choice. Watch whether Saudi Arabia changes its position after 3 neighboring Gulf states were struck in one day. And watch whether Pakistan, which has been the most accurate read of the negotiation state throughout this war, issues any statement about whether Saturday's events have changed the trajectory toward agreement sooner rather than later. Iran tried to hit Doha airport. Qatar shot down 2 jets and struck Iran. Trump said totally unacceptable and one big glow. The war has expanded. The ceasefire is in name only if it exists at all. If you found this useful, push back on it in the comments. I will see you in the next one.